In this NEP series. Today's topic is looking at teachers, the profession of teaching and teacher education in NEP 2012. To share her valuable thoughts on the topic, we have Professor Padma M. Sarangapani as our esteemed speaker for today. We welcome you, ma'am. Professor Sarangapani is Professor of Education and the Chairperson of the Center for Education, Innovation and Action Research at TISS Mumbai. She has been a member of various committees and missions, including the steering group of the National Curriculum Framework 2005. Is a member of the International Editorial Board of British Journal of Sociology of Education and also the founder editor of Contemporary Education Dialogue. The Connected Learning Initiative project led by ma'am has been awarded by UNESCO in 2018. She has published widely in the area of school education as well as teacher education in renowned journals. Welcome, ma'am, and now I request you to please start with the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shivani, and thank you to the school at Hyderabad for inviting me to speak today. So I've tried to organize my thoughts, and I will share my screen just to hold the stream of ideas that I want to discuss today together. So just give me a moment and let me do that. Yeah, I hope you can all see the screen. And if any of you have trouble hearing me clearly, or the quality of the sound especially is not good, just pause and alert me to this so that I can juggle around with the technology and try to set it right. Yeah, so I'm planning to do the following in this talk. What I want to do is just give you a little bit of the background of the context in which to think about the NEP. At least it helps me. I do tend to read the NEP quite from the point of view of where the sector is and what are the kinds of issues that have got flagged over the last 15, 20 years, to which I expect the policy to respond. And since the theme of our presentation is teacher education and the profession, I want to spend a little bit of time on the background around the conception of teacher, how the profession and our thinking about the profession has been evolving, and also the trajectory of developments in teacher education. And then I want to foreground the NEP and ask the question of how it measures up. And finally, I want to share with you some reflections that I've been having on the question of policymaking in current times. So that's how I want to divide my talk today. Yeah. So this thick slide is kind of giving you an overview of the background to the NEP around the three themes of which are the focus of this talk, which is around the themes of the teacher, the profession of teaching, and teacher education. And I kind of trace the background as a period of development, beginning more or less with the Kothari Commission and ending with the context which the NEP 2020 in which the NEP 2020 has come to be shaped. I think the key idea in the Kothari Commission, which is of value to note and notice, which directly impacted on our imagination of teachers, how they work together as a community, how they support each other, was around the idea of the school complex. And the school complex idea definitely envisaged that at schools there would be communities of teachers supporting and working with each other. And it also envisaged a kind of a hierarchical arrangement in which senior teachers would be able to mentor junior teachers. The Kothari Commission carried a very dominant idea which has continued to influence our perception of teachers even to present times, which is that secondary teachers are somehow more competent and capable than primary school teachers. and secondary school teachers would guide and mentor primary school teachers. So there was a kind of a professional hierarchy implicit in the imagination of the school complex that the Kothari Commission had proposed. While we do look back at the Kothari Commission as a very important takeoff point in policy making in India, and probably the first major policy took place along with the Kothari Commission, there was largely, I think, the sector has seen a kind of a lull, and it was only in 1986 when the program of action and the NEP 1986 came into existence that there was a lot of energy and um, excitement around new imaginations and new formulations around education and our own commitment as a nation to achieving education and quality education for all. So while the Kothari Commission took place almost 20 years earlier, it took place in a context in which there was a lot of deficit financing, and overall there was very little that happened very concretely as a consequence of Kothari Commission. Education continued to remain primarily a state subject, making it to the concurrence list, but with very little centrally driven vision and imagination shaping the trajectory of education in the country. NEP 86 made major changes in this. And specifically, I want to draw attention to two features of the NEP 86, which are of relevance to us. The first is that it laid the grounds for the launch of a centrally sponsored scheme in teacher education. And this is probably the first time that there was explicit attention given to the development of indigenous institutions for teacher education. And specifically, I have in mind the DIETs and the SCRTs as central to this imagination of the spread of quality teacher education. The CSST and overall in the NEP, we see a strong decentralized vision and a faith in the innovativeness of ordinary government school teachers. And in fact, the Diet expected that there would be a cell in the Diet which captured local innovations, attempts to solve problems, and would localize curriculum, making it more relevant to the needs of the district in which the Diets were located. So that's the kind of imagination that we see in the NEP 86. Along with that, we also see the establishment of the National Council for Teacher Education coming about almost soon after the NEP. And this was almost in response to the growth of um, teacher education in the open and distance learning sector. And the NCT's primary responsibility was to regulate the sector, particularly the spread of open and distance learning. In those days, it was called distance education and teacher education. Between 1985 and 2005, the nature of education and especially work with teachers and teacher education has largely been shaped by the DPEP and the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan. And what we see in these two missions is firstly the growth of centralization in the programs that are imagined and driven in the country, as well as a deficit imagination of the teacher, which is responded to through extensive in-service teacher education. Along with this, we also see the growth in the mission mode of working in education and a kind of an increasing mainstreaming and justification of para teachers, contractual teachers to support the systemic expansion. Between 2005 and 2009, we see another phase in policy making and initiatives around teachers and teacher education. We see a kind of an intensification of the NCTE and its presence in the teacher education space. It becomes more visible as a regulatory authority. And we also see increasing formalization of teacher qualifications or professional qualifications as mandatory requirement of becoming a teacher. But along with this, we also see, and I will come to this later, the growth in NPM discourses or deficit discourses of teachers, increasing call to regulate teachers, hold them more accountable. So from the 2000s onwards, there's a kind of a growth in this discourse. And most recently, the context in which the NEP 2020 has come about is an increasing centralization in policymaking and initiatives in education. It's almost as if most of the agency in the sector rests in the center. And there's also an increasing use of technology in the sector. And there's an emergence of the discourse around vocational education and school education in the sector. I'm drawing attention or pulling out some of these strands because I think as we read the NEP, I would like to keep in mind some of these background trajectories as we understand the way the sector has been growing and has been getting shaped over the last 50 years. Along with this, and I don't want us to forget that there has been a dramatic growth in private schooling along with English medium preference that we are seeing across the board in all states in the country, a dramatic growth in private teacher education, a growth in private foundations and private actors influencing the public sector, the growth in new uh, public management discourses, growth in the use of technology, and a growing invisibility of teacher unions. In this slide, what I've tried to do is to look at this broader scape of periods that I traced in the last slide, which is the Kothari Commission period, the NPE 86, the missions in education, then the right to education phase, and then the new phase. If we can broadly look at these as the periods in which I want to ask the questions of how do we imagine teachers and who is a teacher? Why should teachers be there? Why should they teach? So what is the conception of teacher that we see across these periods? What is the status of the profession, its status, its pay, its employment terms, and how has that been developing over these periods? And finally, what is the status of teacher education over these periods, especially the NCT regulation, funding, and institutional arrangements for curriculum and pedagogy? How have these been changing and developing over the periods? I'm going to just draw your attention to some features that we see. In the 60s, when the teacher or the profession of teaching was talked about in the Kothari Commission, there was this strong thrust of the importance of the teacher in the whole project of building the nation and building and bringing about communal harmony within the nation. So you see that discourse in the Mudaliar Commission. And then in the Kothari Commission, there is this talk of nation building. And in fact, when you speak to teachers who come from that period, they all see themselves as being importantly patriots, committed to the task of nation building. And they draw their inspiration of their professional work from that imagination of the teacher. But at the same time, when we look at some of the sociological studies being carried out during that period, we notice that the profession is dominated by upper caste teachers, and they have problematic casteist attitudes about educability of children from the lower castes and regarding girls as well. So we see this imagination of the teacher in the Kothari Commission. In the NPE, the thrust shifts towards this need for inclusion and universalizing element to education. And this kind of paves the way almost in the mission mode work in which it seems to be okay for teachers to be from the community. So this whole discourse of community-based teachers acquires a lot of legitimacy in the mission period. The whole notion that more women should enter into the profession because they bring motherly qualities also acquires legitimacy during this period. But at the same time, we do see greater diversification and diversity in the profiles of teachers. More teachers from lower socioeconomic groups begin to enter into the profession as uh, reservation criteria begin to get employed and applied on the sector itself. Uh, but the mood of that period is on ensuring basic minimum education for all, and enabling that to achieve universal enrollment. And that's the kind of imagination that informs uh, who comes to be a teacher. As we move into the 2009 period, the right to education period, there's a feeling that the recruitment begins to stagnate, and the growth of employment is primarily in the private sector and the low fee paying sector. So that's the quality of the profession during that period. But at the same time, there are these two discourses which teachers are held to. On the one hand, the need for inclusion, the need to become special educators and cater to inclusion of children with special needs on the one hand, while on the other hand, gaining of the discourses on learning outcomes begins to take shape during this right to education period. And finally, by the time we are in the 2010s onwards, while the discourse on teachers as professionals begins to pick up, we at the same time we see that the contractual pool of this profession begins to grow. The SES profile of teachers begins to get very diverse. So if you look at the UDICE data and so on, we find large proportions of teachers from OBC, SC, ST in the profession. But at the same time, there is a kind of a feminization that we begin to see in the profession. And the discourse of the profession increasingly begins to hold it responsible for what the NEP is now calling foundational learning. So we can see that in different phases, in the different policies that have informed, I mean, they inform the way in which our imagination of the profession really begins to develop and grow over these rough periods that I have outlined. I won't spend too much time on the other two dimensions that I want to pick up later on in this discussion, which is the professional status and pay and employment terms of the teacher. I think you can more or less anticipate the phases that we see. Um, in the early periods, even in the 60s, the subject is largely a state subject, and there's a huge amount of variation from state to state. Bengal, for example, doesn't mandate professional qualifications of teachers. Until almost like 20 years ago, it was not even a requirement in recruitment of teachers. And so we see a lot of diversity and distinction from state to state on the professional status and the requirements that are accorded to it. In the 80s onwards, the salaries of teachers seem to improve, but along with that, we see the emergence of discourses of derision, as we are calling them in a recent handbook, and we begin to hear virtues of low-paid community and para teachers and how they deliver better because they are held accountable. So that discourse around the profession begins to form in the 1980s. And by the time we are in the right to education period, while the right to education is able to consolidate the need for formal qualifications of teachers, at the same time, there's almost an explosion of this perception of the overpaid government teacher who neglects his or her job and is unaccountable. And we see this in all these teacher absenteeism studies that begin to be formed and begin to express themselves during this period. And the systematic comparison of the private school teacher to the government school teacher, always playing up the better ability to deliver of the private school teacher in comparison to the government school teacher. So that's the way in which the discourse around the profession is getting shaped and is being driven over the last 50 years. So increasingly today, we are hearing discourses around performance management and standards testing of teachers, and it's acquiring a lot of legitimacy in the context in which the NEP 2020 is getting shaped. Finally, if I look at the segment on teacher education and the NCT, we find that the Kothari Commission more or less inherits the British legacy of a diploma for primary school teachers versus a degree for secondary school teachers. So in other words, formalizing this hierarchy between primary school teaching being a vocation or vocational education leading to a diploma, while secondary school teaching is more theoretically loaded and based in the university, leading to a degree, almost structurally consolidating a problem that we continue to experience the effects of even till present day. In the 80s, from the 86 onwards, we do see the formalization of institution building through the centrally sponsored schemes. But at the same time, they fall to the wayside because the mission of the DPP and the SSA almost hijacked the entire agenda of teacher education with the institution of the block and cluster resource centers. And so the institution building capacity of the state really gets withered down in favor of these mission mode centers that get established. In 86 onwards, we find that distance education gets delegitimized successfully by the work of the NCT, but at the same time, privately self-financed teacher education almost explodes. We also find that the government's own attention shifts from pre-service education into in-service education. And we find almost no development in teacher education for arts education, music education, physical education, and so on. By the right to education time, the NCT emerges as a corrupted, failed institution, even while it consolidates its institutional influence. And it leads to a distortion in the sector with a complete sidelining of the universities, a centralization of the NCTE, and a kind of a situation emerging in which the private self-financed college almost hold a field day in defining the sector. And as a way to curb this, the teacher eligibility test gets introduced into the sector as a new regulatory effort by the state to check quality. Um, Although we have the Justice Verma Commission, which triggers reform in the sector, if effectively it seems to have led to intensification of regulation and increasing bureaucratization and bureaucratic hold of the regulatory apparatus of the sector. I'm just presenting to you here some figures behind these trends. What I want you to just notice is the growth over the years of the proportion of teachers in the private sector, almost increasing by 10 percentage points between 2007 to 2015. Yeah. Please also notice the percentage of contractual teachers in the sector and how that has been increasing over the years. You know, we can see it stands at about more than 13%. It was 13% in 2015, and we're looking at 5 years from then. So we could expect it today to be anywhere between 15 and 16%. We find that even though the professional qualifications of teachers has been increasing, but even 5 years ago, it was not saturated. The sector still tends to employ people without professional qualifications and continue to find loopholes which lead to the justification of this. What is really interesting is that this contractual employment is not only there in the private unaided sector, but it's also a feature of the government sector. And in fact, in some states, as the slides will show you, in some states, the contractual teachers is more than 60% of secondary teachers are contractual. And you can see this in the slide. Many of the northeastern states, Punjab, Haryana, the profession almost it appears to be dead because 60% of teachers are contractual and there are no regular employments being made of teachers. This other graph shows you the way exponential growth of private teacher education institutions in the sector. It's really almost all the growth in the sector is on account of the private teacher education institutions. And I think even exponential is an understatement for as a description of the rate at which the sector has grown in the last 20 years. So having given you this background of the sector, I want to now move into looking at the NEP and basically providing you with a short commentary on how the NEP measures up in relation to all these three themes: the theme of teachers, the theme of the profession, and finally, the theme of teacher education. Am I audible? Are you having any trouble listening to me?
No, ma'am, you're audible. It's clear.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So recently I wrote an article along with my colleague Meera Chandran on the status of teachers and the teaching profession. And what we noted is that in the NEP, the word teacher occurs 222 times. It comes third after the term school, which has about 400 references, and the term nation or national, which has close to 400, between 300, 400 references. So it's a term that is heavily used in the NEP, and the NEP actually upfront states the centrality of teachers to deliver the vision of the NEP of transforming education. But if we look at the types of teachers that it envisages, the NEP actually does talk about many, many kinds of teachers which the school system will need. In addition to talking, it talks about the subject teachers, but it also brings into the picture the need for vocational teachers, the need for arts teachers, crafts teachers, music teachers, physical education teachers. So the profession really needs to, in its imagination, embrace all these kinds of teachers. And I think it's important for us to remind ourselves about it. Otherwise, we tend to focus or think about only the academic scholastic disciplines when we think about teachers, and we forget that the vision of the NEP requires that all these kinds of teachers be found and be available in schools. Of course, the NEP does imagine that the school complex is going to deliver the optimization of the availability of all these kinds of teachers, that these may be shared resources shared by all many schools and within a school complex, because it may not be possible for single small school units to employ all the kinds of teachers who are needed to deliver a holistic curriculum. The question of who comes to be a teacher is not something which the NEP directly engages with, but the very fact that it repeatedly refers to the fact that it must attract the best and the brightest. It needs that the profession needs to attract the best and the brightest. It needs to find these outstanding teachers. Leaves you with the feeling that the NEP doesn't seem to think. The analysis of the NEP suggests that who is coming to be a teacher today is quote unquote not good enough, and that we're not getting the best and the brightest to come into the profession. And that's something that the NEP is effectively communicating to us, that the question of who comes to be a teacher needs to be influenced by the policy, and we need to get people who are more qualified to come and become teachers. The NEP does in many sections refer to not para teachers, but a kind of an informalized uh, group or a non-formal group of people, adults, capable adults from community, expert practitioners of crafts, and so on, who will become available to school as mentors. It has fortunately dropped this idea of volunteering, excessive volunteering, which was a part of the draft NEP, but it does retain this idea of the involvement of a large non-formal pool, contributing to enhancing the quality and the scope of the school educational experiences of students. It somewhat tangentially refers to the need to diversify teacher profiles when it re-invokes the idea of bringing in the block institutes of teacher education in districts where there is concentration of students from SC/ST communities and minority communities. But what is the mission and the vision which guides teachers? What is the mood that we take away from the policy? Like, from the Kothari Commission, we take away the mood that we need to um, really support. Teachers need to support national development. And when we read the NEP 86, we take away this mood that teachers need to support the expansion and inclusion of students within the project of universal elementary education. In the NEP 2016, we see that there is a kind of an anxiety in the mood of somehow enabling India to arrive on the international stage with a very robust educational system to take its place among other nations. That kind of mood guides is evident in the um, NEP 2020. So partly teachers are uh, need to become responsible for that. At the same time, there is this anxiety of the bottom falling off and foundational learning collapsing. And therefore, the need for teachers to become courageous, be driven by this need, a patriotic call almost, to rededicate themselves to delivering foundational literacy and numeracy for all. And that's the kind of vision and mission which kind of is guiding the professional ethos. So there is this call to reminding ourselves about our roots, about our national how great we were in the past, and how we need to occupy our place among the nations and inculcate in our students national pride and a sense of national commitment.
Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have 5 more minutes for the discussion and then we'll move to
Sure.
the question hour session.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The how does the profession measure up? Overall, as far as the profession is concerned, there are only 4 references to the profession itself. There are 6 references out of which, no, there are 5 references out of which 4 are about the status of the profession and how much it has fallen. A recent survey of the professions by the Varkey Foundation found that in India, the profession of teachers is comparable to the profession of librarian. And one of my students, Lata, who was researching teachers who were opting for diploma in teacher education and becoming primary school teachers, for them, the profession of a primary school teacher was comparable to the profession of a bus conductor. So really, that's where the status of the profession is. In terms of quality and motivation, the NEP really offers both this new enhanced teacher education as one option to improve quality. And with regards motivation, it largely draws attention to the need to improve the basic working conditions of teachers in schools. The fact that there are no working toilets in school and that schools can often be dull, depressing environments, and that must be improved in order to motivate teachers, is something that the NEP does talk about. But in terms of improving the contractual terms by which teachers work, the livelihood, the professional pay, the NEP has only one reference to it. So it really doesn't engage with the question of the profession in its most basic terms, which is its employment. And as I showed you in the earlier slide, in some states, more than 60% of teachers are contractually employed. So there is clearly a crisis in terms of the professional terms on which, employment terms on which people are coming into the profession. But the NEP really doesn't recognize this as an issue with which it needs to engage. On the other hand, it does talk about career management and career pathways as rewards for outstanding teachers. And it increasingly uses this idea of incentivizing people to perform and measuring performance, holding people to measurable standards as the way by which motivation can be built into the profession by this kind of external rewards that can be built in. Incentives are really a system of external rewards. So it really doesn't think about professional ethic, professional autonomy, although it speaks about professional autonomy or professional satisfaction as the drivers of the profession, but it does seems to think about the profession in what I regard rather thin terms and largely a new public management imagination of the profession. In terms of how the NEP measures up with regards to teacher education, it does have several references to the word teacher training actually rather than teacher education. On the question of the sites of teacher education, the NEP does achieve 2 important things. One is that it wants teacher education to take place in composite colleges, moving away from teacher education institutes as standalone entities. And it also takes teacher education from school education into higher education in terms of the organization in the ministries. It recommends 4-year teacher education program in which right from nursery school teachers up to secondary school teachers, everybody is trained through a 4-year undergraduate degree program. And in this, it offers a structural break from an issue with which we have been dealing right from the British colonial period. And interestingly, it also brings back the 2-year, the 1-year, the ODL, and the technology use in the preparation of pre-service teacher education. On in-service teacher education, the NEP is calling for a continuation of in-service teacher education, referring both to the use of technology to continue to do this, as well as offering the possibility of inset as continued professional development in that frame. Although it doesn't completely define professional management of in-service teacher professional development, it does talk about responding to teacher needs, offering choice, and so on. In terms of regulation, the NEP does strongly recommend that teacher education is removed for NCTE and is integrated into a larger higher education regulatory authority, while NCT itself begins to move towards regulating professional standards. And that is a major shift, because so far the NCT has actually said very little about the profession of teaching, and it has had a lot to say about teacher education. With regards curriculum and pedagogy of teacher education, the NEP doesn't really say very much, but it does speak about the need to diversify faculty for teacher education. On the question of resources and funding, the NEP really has almost nothing to say about where the resources and funding for this transformation of teacher education is going to come from. And it's largely silent on this particular question. I want to kind of end with a few 5 points of reflection. So if we look at the NEP, I would say that its record is mixed. I was actually tempted to give it marks on each of its recommendations and kind of taught up to see where it fares, because some of the recommendations are things that I would strongly endorse. But some of the other recommendations, I'm really doubtful whether they are thought through, whether they are based on evidence, and whether they would actually pave the way for, whether they should be taken seriously at all. And still other recommendations are contradicting each other. So how seriously should we take policy is a question with which I'm left, partly because of these questions on the recommendations. Some of them are positive, some of them are really seem naive, but also because of the question of the manner in which the intent to drive the policy itself is located within the central government, and the question of whether we should take policy seriously. Sometimes I feel we take policy over seriously, because it's not as if all that happens finds justification in policy. So a policy of this kind is not statutory, and it doesn't necessitate that actions will flow from it. It's largely indicative of the direction that a state should take. But whether the state will actually take that direction is something, it's a bit of an open question. So I don't know how exercised we need to get about the direction that policy actually recommends. And often it is what gets implemented, which is much more important than what the policy itself says. Now, is the policy guided by evidence from research? I think on that count, it's really very mixed. Although this is the age in which evidence-based policy is like the clarion call, I would say that several things in the sector on teachers and teacher education are not guided strongly by evidence. There's actually very mixed evidence about the efficacy of incentives and performance pay on improving teacher performance. There's almost no evidence that 4-year teacher education programs should become the mainstay of the sector and almost totally replace other pathways into the profession. Another question that comes to my mind, which I think is worth thinking about, is whether the policy is, to reflect a little bit on policy making in present times. Some researchers have observed that Kothari Commission was the last time in which we had a large agreement on the basis of policy. And even 1986 policy, although today we may remember it with a great deal of nostalgia, it was quite contested and controversial at the time in which it came out. And it was the object of a lot of criticism, both politically as well as academically. And the question is whether we can have a new kind of consensus ever established around policy in present times. And in the absence of consensus, what do we do? I think the process by which this particular policy was constructed tried to claim that a new political settlement has been achieved, and we have through this achieved a new educational settlement or a kind of a consensus building or agreement. I want to just remind you about the extensive consultations which were invited across the country 5 years ago, leading to lakhs and lakhs of suggestions coming in from all strata of society on the direction of policy. And whether, therefore, we can claim that the new policy represents the arrival of some kind of consensus. And I think that there is an open question on it. But whether we can ever, in this current political climate and economic climate, achieve consensus is, I feel, an open question. So that again brings back the question of what do we then do about policy and how seriously should we take it? The next question is really with regards what is worth doing from among the many recommendations that the policy is making in relation to where the resources to do it will come from. And right now, if you look at the status of the economy, there seem to be only three models available to us. The first is an austerity model, which is largely the model under which the Kothari Commission's recommendations were implemented. You know, those were very difficult economic times. They were hard times, and that influenced agency and action and transformation. Or should we go in for some kind of a bootstrapping entrepreneurial model, both philanthropic entrepreneurism, governmental entrepreneurism, as well as market entrepreneurism? Whether that's going to guide and direct the direction of what will happen. And I think that really leaves us with the question of to do or not to do. I think that's the question of to do or not to do and what to do at the end of the day. So thank you. Those were my concluding reflections.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now we will go ahead with the questioner session, and I request my audience to raise their hand for addressing their questions. Also, there are certain questions on the chat box, so I'm just calling out the name and they can ask their questions. We have Prahlad Kathole. Sir, can you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Padma, actually, there are two questions from my side. Actually, incentivizing teachers for their work is that it clearly says that there will be some kind of punishment for non-performing teachers. That is, I believe that there should be some liability of performance on teachers. But saying that there will be upward movement for teachers who are performing, those who are not performing, it is very obvious that those who are not performing, they will be punished by not giving upward movement. And we are very well known, or we are well known about the past, that what happened in the structure or in the system when these kind of incentives are provided. Right. This is one, and two is there will be a tenure track system kind of teacher. So what will happen to this kind of arrangement in teacher as a profession?
Right. See, this whether a system like tenure tracking can be applied across the board in as vast a profession as school teaching is really, I think, a question that we should ask ourselves. And how credibly can a tenure tracking system be applied? And what are the measures against which tenure tracking will be measured? What are the professional standards to which tenure tracking will be held? You know, which will determine the tracking of that tenure. I think that's really a very, very huge and ambitious expectation, that we will be able to have a credible system which will do all this. If we look at most of the kind of professional standards testing devices that are existing today, there is very little evidence that they actually yield robust measures of what teachers are able to do in relation to the context in which they need to work. You know, and can we really apply the same standards of tenure tracking to teachers working in middle class environments compared to teachers working in rural environments with migratory children? What kind of expectations do we need to set up for each of these environments? I think that's really a very big, difficult and complex question. And I don't think we should be at all very convinced that we can have credible measures evolve for these. That's the first point. The second is that there is this kind of assumption that the work of teachers flows out of the person of the teacher, neglecting the context in which the teacher works. And this whole structure of rewards and punishments, when it focuses on the person of the teacher, that really becomes a problem, because it is the system of education that delivers education, not individual teachers. It's a system of education that produces learning in children. And most of these structures boil down to very crude measures of student learning outcome as the primary um, objective marker of teacher efficacy. I think it's highly complicated. Even the best research which is being done in the world cannot with any confidence speak about such credible systems of performance management. So I don't know, it seems more like threatening discourse at the level of discourse rather than actually something which is practically implementable in my view. And we should be very, very, I think, suspicious. And especially when such structures are created from this notion that teachers are not doing, when you approach it from this negative assumption about the teacher and her work or the teacher's credibility, that itself creates a certain dynamic which vitiates the entire process. No amount of NCT regulation has checked private teacher education colleges from doing about just what they have done for so many years. So what is the basis on which we should believe that we can have credible regulation features of teachers? I think that's really a question for us to ask.
Okay, next we have Dr. Neha Bilsare. Ma'am, can you unmute yourself and ask the question? Dr. Neha Bilsare.
Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to ask two questions. One is about pre-service teacher education and another about in-service teacher education. For ensuring highest quality of pre-service teacher education programs, what steps should be taken by government with respect to teacher education institutes? And if all teacher education is going to transform under higher education, multidisciplinary higher education universities or institutions, then what will be role of diets, and how to improve quality of in-service teacher education in your view? Thank you.
Okay. So first, with regards to transformation of pre-service teacher education, I feel that the Justice Verma Commission more or less laid out the trajectory in which we should grow and go. And the NCFT 2009, I think, largely continues to be valid in our reimagination of teacher education. So I would say the ground has been laid and the question is really about realizing this. One of the key problems that we have experienced in the last 10 years in realizing the NCFT vision is our inability to do two things. One is develop good quality resources that student teachers and teacher educators can study and use in their classrooms. All new textbooks, new videos, multimedia resources, which exemplify the kinds of knowledges that the NCFT 2009 are calling for. That's something that we have not invested in and not developed over the last 10 years. And this needs to be there in all the Indian languages. And I think then the NCFT vision will begin to concretely materialize in the lives of teachers and lead to new teacher formation. So I would say that's really what we need to continue to do in terms of improving quality of PST. And I think more initiatives to write new textbooks, from trustworthy sources. NCET should really be stimulating a lot of this kind of work for the sector, which has not really been happening. With regards to the diets, I think that, you've really pointed to an institutional space, which is going to need tremendous reconceptualization. So on the one hand, we have the call in the NEP that teacher education needs to become a part of composite institutions. So that really means that both the pre-service work of the diets as well as its in-service work will need to shift to maybe the local government college, and the diet faculty need to get integrated into a department of teacher education in a local government arts and science college, perhaps. But on the other hand is the work of supporting school improvement through school visits and support to school teachers. And there, I think the block and the cluster resource centers are going to get merged, will need to get merged with the school complexes that are being talked about again in the new education policy. And I think the work of the diet will need to be reimagined in these two directions. One direction towards school support structures, and the other direction towards professional development of teachers, whether it's pre-service or in-service. And I think that's really what there will need to be considerable reimagination of the diets, therefore, um, to be able to deliver this vision of the NEP. Your last question was with regards what should we be doing in in-service teacher education. I think the question is quite open and requires a lot of creative rethinking and response. I, for one, through my many years of work in service professional development sector, am fairly convinced that short-term workshops don't really contribute meaningfully to transforming professional knowledge base of teachers. And I have been an advocate of offering short courses to teachers and integrating professional development into credit-based structures that can lead to professional learning of teachers, moving away from short workshops of teachers. I think the teachers need to have a lot more agency and choice in selecting, but they also need to be held to learning through short practice-based courses and so on. Some work that my colleagues have been doing at the center, which also I find very, very useful and productive in the in-service teacher education professional development space, is hosting and running communities of practice. I'm increasingly convinced that professional learning is social and it happens best in the company of peers. And the more we are able to sustain meaningful peer dialogue in which we are a part as teacher education community, we can actually begin to see more growth in profession in CPD of teachers. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do. So in a way, I feel that the in-service teacher education space is rich with possibilities of new ideas and experimentation and innovation.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you.
Ma'am, can I request you to stop sharing the screen?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
And next we have Bhav Gawande. Sir, can you please ask your question? Bhav Gawande, sir. Yes, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes.
There is no question. That was my comment.
No, but it's great to have you on this talk, Bhav Gawande-ji.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I've been an admirer of you and your famous book as well. And I'm very
How
pleased.
come?
Yeah. Vijaya.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, ma'am.
And I think those of you who haven't heard of Bhav Gawande or read his book should do that. I think he's one of the remarkable people of Indian education. Yeah.
One thing I ask, madam,
Yes.
because policy says each stage is equally important, right from pre-primary to secondary.
Yes.
Now, if the teacher is teaching to primary classes, and if she purchases the 10+2 qualification, there will be 6-month course for her.
Mm-hmm.
And if only 10 class plus, she will be having 1-year course.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, in teacher education, it says that for each stage there will be 4-year degree course. Doesn't it not contradict itself?
I think there are a lot of contradictions when the NEP tries to get into the nitty-gritties and starts defining bridge courses, 1-year course, 2-year course. I think it kind of creates unnecessary kind of contradictions. Absolutely. But I think that on the whole, the 4-year model is a very, very important move in the sector. And I am very hopeful that this will address the structural problems that we have been facing in the sector of primary school teachers aspiring to become secondary school teachers and having to get BA degrees in order to move into doing MEd. I think these kinds of problems have been there because primary school teaching has been only awarded a certificate or a diploma. And it has also not been the subject of serious research and development in the university departments. So I think requiring, kind of encouraging university departments to directly engage with primary school, early foundational learning period and teacher preparation is very important positive suggestion of the NEP. But whether this is going to translate into actually making the professions equal in terms of employment contracts, the NEP is totally silent on it. And I fear that as long as we have different salaries for primary school and subject school teachers, it's going to become like a classification. Everybody writes the entrance test. Going to end up with a model of that kind unless we're able to address equivalence of pay, in my view. Yeah.
True, very true.
Okay, next we have Ganga ma'am, Ganga Shirsar. Ma'am, can you unmute yourself?
Good evening, madam. I am Ganga Shirsad, BRCC coordinator from Goa. Just now you said that it is possible that BRC, CRCs will be merged into school complex. How it will be possible?
Sorry, I can't hear you, Gangaji. I've lost your voice.
Madam, I am just asking, you have told
Are any
that
of you able to hear Ganga or hear
there
me?
might be a possibility of merging of BRC, CRCs to the school complex. But now both are having different structure. How it will be possible?
See, I think that the BRC CRC structure will have to be totally, and the school complex is a new structure. Both will have to be dismantled and reimagined. I don't think we can just take old structures and put them into new institutional structures. Absolutely no. And this is something we clearly need to stop certain kinds of activities, structures, and start new ones. We will have to do that. Otherwise, I think we're going to have a mishmash and confusion.
Okay, thank you, madam.
But if we think of the working of a school complex, many of the things that it needs to do need to align to the kind of work that the BRC CRC are supposed to do. They need to invest in better quality monitoring, support of teachers, imagining the academic work of schools. So all this kind of academic mentoring support work will need to merge with the school complex idea for it to become a meaningful, vibrant structure. But this is like very demanding new shift. It's going to require tremendous effort and reimagination, because right now the buildings exist all scattered all over the place, right? All of these institutions have physical buildings, and consolidation is not a simple thing at all.
Thank you, madam.
We have Niladri Pradhan. Ma'am, you can go ahead with your question. Niladri Pradhan.
It's a male name.
Male name. Okay, I'm so sorry. Sir? Ma'am, if you say, I can just read the question.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Research-based teaching is deteriorating day by day, particularly in the context of college working teachers. Can you please tell in this regard and how to improve it?
Sir, I'm in fact not very sure whether college teachers have ever been able to do research-based teaching in the past even. Because college teachers and their work is so removed from the world of research. Most college teachers are not expected to do research. They don't have access to research. Even facilities like Inflip, NET, and so on are not extended to colleges. So where are college teachers going to get access to research is really a question, isn't it? And I think if the NEP is definitely saying, that everybody must get into this research-based mode of teaching, learning, thinking. it's like demanding it. And if you don't do it, then you're somehow deficient and mediocre if you don't engage with research. But I think in addition to college teachers making the effort, universities and spaces of higher education research will need to become much more open and create opportunities to collaborate with college teachers. And I'm really hopeful that we can have large collaborative research projects which are held by universities in which large numbers of college teachers can be involved and have opportunities to access research. I recently, just the other day, I was reviewing a student's work on communities of practice, and she drew my attention to a very vibrant technology-based community of practice of biology researchers and teachers. They had come together using a technology platform to share and discuss research ideas, and they also had one of the 6 groups was on teaching. And this group used to meet once a year physically, but otherwise it was a vibrant group interacting with each other technologically. And I think we should think about having more such initiatives in the Indian context. Universities like TISS should have large networks with school teachers and college teachers, so to give access to active research much more widely within the higher education community. And I think that's something that we should begin to do. Otherwise, in the Indian context, research becomes so exclusive, and it's also about keeping people out of these sacred groups, not giving access. It's really a problem. So hopefully there will be some movement to change some of that.
Thank you, ma'am. Next, we have Ritesh, sir. Sir, you can go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Drishti. Hi, Padma. My question relates to your earlier response as well. I think the policy does imagine the location of teacher education programs also in close connect with the university spaces, and that there is a historic and cultural traditions in how universities have been functioning. So this kind of a confluence, does it also not add to kind of an epistemic burden on the teacher in terms of, one is certainly outcomes and incentives through which the teachers will be judged, but also the demands of, pedagogical practices of a peculiar way, activity driven, discovery based, inquiry led, and, and also in terms of, so there, and artificial intelligence guided, so there is a all comprehensive avatar of the teacher that is imagined, who kind of imbibes through all these different standpoints and actually consolidates it and passes it on to the learner. So I mean, how so there are 2 questions that are related to it. What does it demand of the epistemic reimagination of the teacher? And second, does it also pose a responsibility on the universities, which are structured in a peculiar way, which try and emphasize the liberal orientation and not the practice component much more critically into programs of education? How does one respond to these 2 aspects to the policy reimagination? Yeah.
I think, I suppose the NEP's answer to that is that we'll have these outstanding, best and brightest people who can pull off these complex identities and forms of expertise. Just get the best and they will do it all, type of ambition or hope. So I think that's really what this NEP really doesn't bring coherence. I mean, there's no sense of where the profession is today, is it? In the way in which these expectations from the identity of the teacher get crafted. There's no sense of where we're starting from as we imagine these kinds of complex avatars that teachers are going to grow into. And I think that's where, I mean, many places it's naive, isn't it, as a document? It doesn't, it isn't written, these articulations don't come from a knowledge of how things are and what is possible. It's like stating the impossible, like some kind of a fantasy or a utopia, which is probably not what a policy needs to do. Maybe an inspirational document needs to do, but not a policy, which is a little bit more pragmatic and, you know, it has to convert. If it should convert and if it should be taken seriously, then it needs to be a little bit more grounded. And that's not something that we see when we read the NEP. Yeah, in fact, these kinds of articulations really give you the feeling that there is some fantasy operating rather than a sense of the reality. So that is a problem with the, so we don't know whether to take it seriously, right, when it says things of this kind. On the other hand, that it does create a kind of a burden, I feel. Really, it burdens the imagination of the discipline. If we have to show evidence to a new regulator that we are on a checklist which is generated out of the policy, then I think you and I as professionals of the sector will really we'll have a fit, or we'll be sick. We will feel sick. We will feel disheartened and kind of fed up of putting up acts and producing untruths about what we're really doing, you know, confident that what we're doing is right, but having to conform to some kind of a wild imagination coming out of the kind of lists that this document assembles. It's really problematic. And I think that is really dangerous. If the NEP is converted into that kind of a checklist, I already see tendencies of that. Everybody is just kind of clamoring multidisciplinary. You really feel like you're in an Orwellian farm in which all the animals are chanting 2 legs bad, 4 legs good type of, you know, chorus in the background. And you're just wondering, you know, what to make of terms like multidisciplinarity. All universities should become multidisciplinary by 2030 and calls of that kind. There's this clamor which the NEP has unleashed on the sector. And I fear that the sector of teacher education may also get subsumed under the clamor if we're not careful about how we define the direction of what is doable. I mean, if it doesn't quickly translate into some very measured formulation of what is doable and important to do and set up the direction, we will be lost in this attempt to say everything that is good and sounds right. And I think that is a problem of the policy. And yes, while in many spaces there is this drive towards a liberal orientation, there is also a simultaneous drive to the practice. So you will see these long sentences, right, in which the first words start with the liberal disciplines, and as you move down, you move into ethics, and then you end up with practice and social science. So we have these very, very long composite imaginations which don't leave anything out. And I don't know, it doesn't really give us with any useful handle on how it's going to shape things going forward. And I think, yeah, it's a bit of a worry if we get hijacked into that kind of a regulatory apparatus flowing out of the NEP. So I don't know, maybe we should pick up what it says with which we can work and really try to shape the direction that it needs to take, rather than allow it to get shaped and imposed upon us as some kind of a frame into which we will then have to fit ourselves. We will have a
if I can just ask raise my apprehension over here, Padma, I just wanted to know.
With regards the place of teacher education in the university, Ritesh, I feel it's a very complex history, right? I mean, even among my own colleagues, people refuse to recognize that the reason why education exists as a discipline in the university is because of its core connection with teacher education. Teacher education was the basis on which education even acquired a disciplinary space within the university. But even within higher education, this is very complicated. People will refuse to recognize it. They see teacher education as somewhat a kind of a drudgery, too oriented to the formation of a practice. I think we will have to deal with many of these issues and battles on the higher education front. I mean, I would really like to see IITs and IIMs take up teacher education. And most central university departments offering teacher education, whether they will have the internal wherewithal, the Ashoka universities and so on. Will they be really able to embrace and accept teacher education into higher education is a question, I think, which we will have to wait and see.
Yeah, thank you.
We have Rekha Sharma Sen, ma'am.
Hi, Rekha.
Hi, Padma. Great to listen to you again. I was just wondering, that, I mean, I just felt 2 or 3 places I didn't understand you very well, or what. The 4-year B.Ed program, at one point you said that there isn't really any much research evidence to say that it really would have much of a result, and should it have been put forward as the one single point, single type of a program for teacher preparation. And then yet towards the end you said that it is perhaps one of the best ways to prepare a teacher. So that point, and then once again the NEP, I thought the whole idea of the 4-year teacher education program was to bring about some parity in initial teacher training, and so that this whole thing of teachers moving across levels for better designation or better pay is stopped. And yet you seem to be not very sure that this will actually take place. Right. So I find that these things are a bit contradictory in your talk, and I was really wondering that.
Yeah. So I actually, on the 4-year question, as I see, there is no contradiction in what I'm saying in terms of, I definitely think that bringing primary school teaching and so on into the space of higher education with an undergraduate degree program, as is being proposed, is a very important structural break from the problem that the sector has had. And that is, I think, very important. The problem with the NEP is its move towards insisting that this will become the one major, almost primary way in which teachers will be made. That is, I think, very problematic for the sector. To think that with this, where the profession is today, that people will be able to make a mature decision that they want to be a teacher when they're leaving +2 is a very, very big demand. That is one question. The second is that in many very good quality undergraduate programs, and teacher education is a person-intensive program, it is not even sure that everybody who goes through such a person-forming, confidence-building program will actually continue to remain in the profession and won't move out to being something else and doing something else, having acquired everything that a good undergraduate program should give them. So whether the 4-year program will actually retain people to the profession is a very big question mark, and there's very little evidence to actually support it. The third is that in the world also, it has been found that the 4-year program really does not attract many people to enter it. Even in Singapore, I recently learned that the Singapore National University has to go about recruiting students to come to its 4-year programs, because most students don't want to look at teaching as the first option in their career choices. They would rather. So when can people make mature decisions to become a teacher? So should we load everything of the professional formation onto this 4-year program alone and expect that somehow it's going to solve the problems of status of the profession? I think that is really where the rhetoric for the 4-year really runs into trouble. So I'm all in favor of having a 4-year program and allowing multiple pathways. I would equally say we should have the 2-year B.Ed program and allow multiple pathways in it as well. Allow people in the 2-year program to become primary school teachers, to become secondary school subject teachers. We should have pathways available to people at different stages in their life in which they decide to become teachers. And I think that will much better serve the profession as compared to loading the, so in fact, it was almost like I was relieved to see that the NEP retained the 2-year and the 1 year was like maybe necessary, maybe a bonus, I don't know. But I was actually concerned and worried that the 2-year program will get thrown out totally from the basket of offerings, because in the profession itself, there are many people claiming that teacher status will improve if we go the way in which the law universities have gone, of offering 4-year undergraduate law programs, completely missing the point that learning lawyering is very different from learning to become a teacher. And the point in which you make this decision, really, whether it is appropriate to do it at +2, and that is a good and mature decision. I don't think these questions are being asked, but there's this blind imitation of the law and how it reformed itself and became a high status profession, which is influencing the sector. So that way, I feel that this recommendation really has not looked enough into what the research evidence is regarding the 4-year program. And we need to be much more cautious about it. I will be the last person to rule it out, but I would say let's not load all our hopes on it as the main pathway for teacher profession development. So that's really what I would say. And whether the policy actually says nothing at all about parity of pay, nothing about parity of pay. It has nothing to say about pay actually, except of incentivizing. It doesn't even use the word parity of pay. I think that's a problem.
Then why make everybody go through a 4-year if there won't be a parity of pay?
And what is the promise? It'll end up like a sieving sorting system without the pay parity aspect. The only thing that the 4-year will continue to do is at least allow the upward mobility to happen. So after your 4-year program and you did nursery training or whatever, primary school teaching or whatever it is, you can do a master's and then move into academia or research or aspire to become a head of a school. Those pathways are kept for you of that kind of vertical mobility. But does it deliver parity of pay? No.
Thanks.
We have UTS, somebody named UTS. Sir, ma'am, can you go ahead with your question?
What about students from your program, Drishti? Your colleague.
Monica Sharma. We have Monica Sharma. Many, ma'am, there are many questions down the line.
Good evening. This is Monica.
Yeah.
Ma'am, mainly I want to understand that mostly when we go to I'm a student of MA first year, elementary education. And when we go to the government schools, what we see is there is some kind of lacking in confidence of the teachers, that what teachers are saying is completely irrelevant. And the instructions, what is to be taught, how is to be taught is all top to down approach. So NEP, is there any scope defined where teacher will have more confidence on how to teach it, what to teach it, and maybe in a localized way? Because a teacher in front of her sees migrant kids and kids from economically weaker sections and from higher section as well in one class. She needs to decide a lot of things, but she doesn't have the scope to do it. So what can we see on that?
So the NEP does use this word autonomy, and it does say that teachers in their classrooms should have a much more autonomy over deciding curriculum, aspects of curriculum and pedagogy. So it doesn't like hand over autonomy. Clearly there's a tension in teacher management on the question of how much autonomy and whether teachers are deserving of autonomy and they have the professional capacity to be autonomous, responsible, exercise their autonomy responsibly. Unfortunately, in the system, there's a great deal of skepticism about autonomy for teachers. And recently, writing about this question, I felt that we have basically carried on right from colonial times an approach to thinking of teachers which comes from a deficit model. There's a deficit model. We think of teachers in terms of what they don't have and what they lack. And a lot of the governance of teachers, in service of teachers, is built on this notion of deficit. And we think that the deficit not only makes them less capable in the classroom, but it also renders them with a tendency to become immoral. because they're deficit, then they will kind of try to escape their job. They won't do a good job. They won't be serious and so on. So the profession's management and control is informed by this deficit perception, which is visited upon teachers by the entire administrative hierarchy. And that's kind of a burden that the profession carries and deals with. It's a very, very burdensome. When you speak to teachers themselves, they will tell you that they want more opportunity to be able to cater to the individual needs of children. Teachers don't always feel that they know what needs to be done. You know, they may want to actually seek out resources and support on what should we do, because they may not have received it and they may not be able to address the particularities in which they're located. But the many CPD trainers, well-meaning NGOs and so on actually believe that teachers don't even see the deficit. They actually believe that teachers will ignore the deficit, and that they have negative attitudes regarding children. So there is this very oppositional mentality with which most NGOs and government from the middle classes looks at the teacher and her professional value and worth. In fact, most people don't even know what goes on in those DL-ed colleges. We are very quick to say it's all nonsense, it's all outdated stuff. Actually, when you go to see what goes on in those colleges, you will be surprised. Yes, the concepts and the theories may not be the most updated ones. They may be reading very, very humble, simply articulated stuff, maybe old-fashioned stuff, but it's not just the content of the theory that you read, but there's a lot of work that serious teacher educators do in these humble teacher education colleges, you know, to form strong professional identities, build strong professional ethic, need to address the needs of children, need to respect children. A lot of these values that underline teachers and give them the value base from which professional judgment gets developed and activated, that is getting formed even in these very, very ordinary aided and government run teacher education colleges. I'm not talking about the corrupt sector. I'm talking about sectors that, you know, where teacher educators take their job seriously. Yeah. So it may not be contemporary stuff. They may not know about different childhoods and so on, but a lot of the value base of the profession is getting formed there. But unfortunately, we have such a casteist or classist view of the teacher that when we see the teacher, we only see the gaps and the deficits. We're not able to see what they bring into their work. We're only able to see what they don't have when they enter into the work. And this becomes then the seed of the intervention programs that we build. And it renders always the teacher in a defensive, low down position. Always, the teacher is down there. Always, when we speak, you know, and that it really, I think, becomes the politics of communication in CPD. It becomes a politics of design and intervention. And it's impossible for teachers to break out of it because there is this power hierarchy within which the whole thing operates. And I think if we really have to seriously take the question that you're asking, Monica, we will have to revisit our imagination of teachers, their professional identities, and take much more seriously what they bring, and really interrogate our own deficit perceptions a lot more. I would certainly say there's need for it.
Sure, thank you, ma'am.
Okay, so the next question somebody has asked, but there is connectivity issue, so I'll go ahead with the question. There is a necessity to have formal recognition for teachers and the need to go through proper training. So does the NEP encourage para teachers?
The NEP does not encourage para teaching. I think it does talk about teacher education, and it takes teacher education seriously. The NEP does do that. But it does admit into the space of the school many new kinds of teachers called volunteers and, you know, mentors. That is really very, very fuzzy. What are those people? How do they become recognized to enter into the public space of the school? What is the credibility of their recognition? Is it going to be a community-based thing? that I think it leaves completely open with question marks. On the one hand, it seems like, oh, this is recognizing local talent which may not have received formal accreditation. But on the other hand, it may be opening doors to all kinds of things that communities value, but we in a democratic modern state would think dangerous and irresponsible. So I think that question is really left hanging in the NEP. It's kind of opening doors to new types of entities and not at all clear what the criteria will be and how these new forms and entities will actually get defined. It leaves it open.
Okay, Manish Singh can go ahead with the question. Sir? Manish Singh.
Yes, yes. Good evening, ma'am. I am Manish Singh from second year, TISS Hyderabad.
Yeah.
Ma'am, I have a question a little bit apart from NEP about teaching.
Yeah.
Ma'am, there are a lot of reformation has happened in our country at central level and state level for teachers training and all. But if we see, excluding some states, so there's still teachers are not reformed. Means uh, teachers are not being able to give that much education. I'm talking about primary level education, government school. Means they are doing a lot of, like, they are passing the examination of TET, teacher eligibility test. They are well educated. But if you are going for quality of education, so it's fail. Like if I take case of Uttar Pradesh, I am from Uttar Pradesh. So in 2017 or 18, sorry, 18, the quality of education was worst of UP. So, ma'am, what is the main reason behind it? Because government is also doing a lot of things for teachers, but still there's no reformation in quality of education. So there's any other reason, ma'am, from your side?
I don't know, what is government doing for teachers? Is it that it's giving them jobs, or what is it? What is government doing for teachers?
For teacher means, ma'am, ki like to ensure the quality. Like suppose earlier, before TET, there was anyone could be teachers. By if someone is having BA degree, so he or she can be teacher. But after coming of TET, one must have to pass that exam.
Right.
Then he attend. He can just apply for a teaching job. That's what I'm telling you. And even earlier, the salary of teachers in Uttar Pradesh was very less. But right now, it's very high. Like somewhere it is 50,000, 60,000 for of primary level teachers.
Yeah. But Manish, a couple of things, one is that I believe that teachers are, of course, a very important part of the education system, but it's the education system that has to deliver education, not only teachers. Yeah, so if things are not working, I don't think we should look only at the teachers to answer the question of why it's not working. We should be looking at school leadership, we should be looking at block leadership, district leadership, state leadership. And that's why we should be asking the question of ability or inability of learning to happen within the classrooms. And I think I would personally favor a much more systemic analysis of the failure of teachers to teach, or the failure of the system to deliver education, rather than looking at it as a problem of teachers not being able to teach. That's one question. The second question that I do want you to think about is that really the space of the classroom has become complicated for teachers to work with and deal with. And I'm not very sure that the systems that are in place or the education that teachers have received actually fully prepares them to deal with the complexity that is manifesting in the classrooms that they are working with. And we need to think about why teachers become demotivated. I don't think it's a problem of motivating teachers, but more thinking about what are the factors that demotivate teachers and address those factors.
Yes, ma'am.
When we try to address the question of inability to deliver and takes classroom seriously. That was one. The second is that I'm not very sure. Right now we don't actually have good measures of who are these teachers who were actually negligent, who should not be there. The ones who disrespect their students, ignore them, take them for a ride, abuse them, humiliate them. I think these are seriously problematic if the system allows people of this kind to work and interact with children. Yeah, it is completely inexcusable that a system will allow people of this kind to spend time with children and basically miseducate them. That's not at all the delivery of right to education, right? It's like abuse of the right to education, condemning children to live lives without dignity, not life with dignity. But I think we need to get a handle of that. What happens is that my own belief is that the teachers who don't work and who are negligent completely occupy our imagination and our attention to the extent that we are not able to see those who actually are able to do and deliver. And I think any good management theory will tell you to put your effort behind those who are actually doing and enable them to do more, and really not invest all your energies on trying to correct those who don't do. And I think we have to really think about this as a complex management problem and not simply reduce it to individual teachers and their moral dereliction.
Ma'am, there is any other way that we means like teacher get motivated only for giving education, not for means I want to say that they should not treat that teaching job as a profession instead of their work, like the passion.
Well,
you get my
absolutely. And if you listen to teachers, you will find many of them tell you that the only reason why they stay in the job, where even the officers who visit don't respect them, is because they love the work that they do with their children. And research after research tells us that the first peer group of the first reference group of the teacher is not the professional community, it's the children whom they teach. That means the teachers, and I mean, it is absolutely beautiful and moving. How does a good teacher know? How does a teacher know whether she's good or not, whether she needs to improve or not? Teacher after teacher will tell you it's what my children tell me. The students in my classroom tell me whether I'm good or not, whether I need to improve or not. I don't need to listen to some test. I will not go with what a test tells me, with what a superior tells me. I don't need to go there. It's just working with my students itself tells me whether I'm successful or not. And many teachers are deeply distressed when they're not able to reach out and succeed with their students. So I think we have to really investigate this question of teacher demotivation. What is demotivating teachers? And what can we do to address this kind of demotivation? I simply don't believe that new teachers who enter the profession are already demotivated. I think they become demotivated because of a series of experiences and circumstances that they experience. And there's a lot of new emerging research on newly qualified teachers, which I think supports this view that I'm taking, that there is a lot more optimism in new teachers, and something happens down the way for them to lose that optimism and become demotivated. We need to think about that and address it.
Thank you, ma'am.
Rohini ma'am, you can go ahead with the question.
Yeah, hello ma'am, good evening. Yeah, ma'am, I was just wondering where NEP tries to focus a lot on reviving the languages, where it says the tribal languages have to be revived.
Right.
How does teacher education try to how does the NEP envisage, and how as a teacher, educators, we envisage building more of such teachers who could
work with
bring this languages back? Yeah.
I think that is something that we as a country need to think about within the higher education system, of how to give the Indian languages much greater prominence and a kind of a creative engagement with bringing Indian languages into the mainstream of higher education, including teacher education. I think we need to work on strategies for that. We need to create positions for language teachers in our universities from a range of languages, give it a lot more space and opportunity. And yeah, we really need to work on that a lot more. Unfortunately,
Ma'am, I
language
also
teachers
feel
have become like the bearers of the cultural heritage. Like in any school performance, it was the Hindi teacher, the Telugu teacher, the Tamil teacher. They are the ones who have to do all the ethnic stuff, you know, and they are the ones who have to organize. So we've kind of lumped the Indian languages with some kind of preserving the past and some cultural heritage stuff. And I think we really need to think of Indian languages in a far more vibrant, engaged, modern way, contemporary way, not in some kind of cultural artifact approach to Indian languages. So a lot has to happen, I think, in the Indian languages question. No easy answers for it. But I wonder whether there will be sufficient action research grants, you know, that will give us opportunity to explore and come up with ways in which we can bring a lot more attention to Indian languages. And it has to move beyond translation. We really need to be looking at developing bilinguality and so on with modern Indian languages.
Ma'am, I was also wondering, would this take a longer time? Like if I as a teacher is trying to understand language, like because I have not been, like I come from a Telugu community, but then I don't know the language properly. But if I have to take my subject to those areas, I would require longer training in those aspects so that I could be sufficient enough, like fully professionally, I could deliver my subject with the help of languages, even if I'm talking about science. Yeah.
I think absolutely, but I don't think every solution lies in extending training. And certainly it doesn't lie in overtraining. I think that is one of the problems in the way in which we design teacher education, right? We try to put everything into the education itself rather than enabling things to manifest in the development of practice. And so it really needs to be more like action research possibilities for teachers, you know. So yes, you must, as a teacher of science who is likely to work in Telugu, with Telugu speaking people in Telugu medium schools, you need to take very seriously developing the right vocabulary and ability to explain concepts in Telugu, and you will unlikely achieve it within the 2 years that you are in your B.Ed program maybe. But can there be some way in which the CPD work enables you to continue to develop understanding and resources? But at least can we introduce concepts of bilingual education into the teacher education preparation program? You know, we must take language across the curriculum very seriously then. And there's a lot of very important and interesting research on language transfer in science education itself, which has very, very useful and interesting ideas. In fact, one of my research students from Hyderabad did a work on it, on the kind of resources that science teacher was using, teaching to a dominantly Telugu speaking group. And she invented many practices, which in fact were well aligned with what a lot of bilingual education theory is telling us. So I think we should be exposed to a lot of this. I mean, I think the one really very satisfying thing about the area of our work, education, is that this discipline is live and it's growing. The research possibilities are immense. And there's a lot of very, very meaningful empirical inquiry and theoretical inquiry for all of us to engage with. We're a very new discipline, rich with possibilities for multidisciplinary work. So if anything, it should make these exciting explorations. And that's really what I feel about teacher education, that it should not become very categorical as if we know the answers. But in fact, the preparation of teachers should allow us to discover answers and invent answers. There's very little actually which is known in a highly research scientific way, and there's a lot of scope and need for a research-based, university-based engagement to happen.
Ma'am, we have already extended the timing, so I would ask you if you want to go ahead with one or two more questions, or you want to call
maybe
it an end.
I think maybe just one more question, and then if you can share the questions to me, I'm happy to just look at them. And
sure, ma'am. We have Seema Sarohi. Ma'am, you can go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so ma'am, in continuation to the para teacher discussion, like NEP clarify the recruitment criteria, like it emphasized like BEd program, everything put together. But at the same time, like as you were mentioning, like it does not like encourage the debate of equity. And like in the case of para teacher, like you can see like given the evidences, like election cycle and teacher recruitment are sinking like as we progress in different states. And in that, like until unless we address the quality as well as the equity debate in teacher recruitment as well as teacher professional development, because para teachers remains to be at the bottom of the hierarchy in a school. At the same time, they are like trying to survive in that system, and we are not addressing that question of recruitment and their professional development. And like,
Yeah.
is this a wholesome idea of how our teachers are placed in a school system?
No, in fact, in a recent article that I wrote, I felt that this is one question which is like a deadly silence in the NEP. The fact that the entire question of teacher appointment, I mean, employment is not actually taken seriously in the NEP. I feel that that is really deadly, that silence. And I think it is not by chance. In fact, if you look at the status of teachers in higher education, you will find that this silence continues to be deadly there and takes up even more dangerous forms in higher education. You know, I can very well visualize a scenario of increasing casualization of teachers. Like we will all be like independent tuition teachers setting up shop, offering our courses, and some kind of a blockchain system of accumulating our work, and you know, be getting paid by the number of students who register for our courses. All these kind of scenarios are very, very possible. And this entire, you know, new fantasy of a bag of credits that you will take around, you know, take shopping for credits here and there to accumulate and earn your degrees. I don't really know where that is going to leave us with the state of higher education generally, and what education is supposed to produce. You know, if you don't have an imagination of education and you're going to just reduce it to learning, which is what the NEP seems to be doing, then I think I'm not surprised that there is this silence on the question of teachers and the whole question of the profession. And I think it's equally true of both. In fact, I was discussing it and I was told, you know, so, you know, yeah, of course it's there. And unless there is more money put behind recruitment, but it's already happening around us. Look, it's already happening. There are so many private colleges are employing teachers like this, and tuition houses are employing teachers like this. I mean, but isn't that dangerous? And isn't that exactly what a policy should be doing? It should be taking stock of what is happening and trying to correct, and not actually legitimizing it and building a system based on technology, blockchain management to allow people to accumulate credits and arrive at courses. I think this is really dangerous, this kind of movement, and it alters the meaning and character of education itself. I feel, you know, when we stop seeing it as education and we start thinking of it as learning this skill, learning this knowledge, getting this competency. That's the way we are kind of, and so the whole notion that education leads to a particular identity, forms a particular agency, which is reformed in the public space of a university, that completely recedes. So who is the person in the background deciding, you know, I need to do this course, I need to get these 5 credits here, 2 credits there? It's entirely in the space of the private. It recedes into the private, and it's based upon this individual's assessment of the market and where I'm likely to get employment. It's no longer a public formation of the person in higher education, or at least that is there for a few, the few who can afford it, who can go to these elite institutions, which will have well-funded faculty. They will form as individuals with agencies reformed in the space, while everybody else is in this entrepreneurial self, you know, shopping around for courses type of model. And that's really what emerges as I read the higher education sector. And I feel very, very disheartened thinking the silence on the profession in the school education sector is not silence of, you know, that it got missed. There seems to be some deeper design possibly in it. And that,
yeah, overall it is it is seemingly like NEP sees teacher as a tool to provide learning, but it does not see the larger implication of teacher having itself in its philosophical debate, uh, like imbibing knowledge-based society, which they try to do in its vision, try to capture
You know,
it.
I feel that the teacher as a professional is a very, it's a very unusual type of professional. There is
Yeah.
definitely an instrumental aspect to be a teacher. Yes, why? We are teachers because we need to make children learn. So there's a certain instrumentality in our being as a teacher. But this idea of learning is something that we need to watch very carefully. And I feel that there's a great deal of difference about learning that happens in a tuition experience from learning that happens in a school. And I've been thinking about the notion of public formation of individuals as being the main task of schools. You know, it's kind of linked to a larger aim in education, which is
Yeah.
not just what it's not just personal. It becomes more public, and then the possibilities begin to open up. Not only what you bring, but what also a teacher brings into the setting really shapes. Um, and when I say teacher, please don't think of this individual teacher producing miracles
Yes.
by working with children. It's really embedded in a school system through which all this is happening. And that I feel is really, that imagination of the school begins to, um, I mean, it's much more clear in the higher education space, if you ask me, that the imagination of the higher education university is really thrown into flux because we don't know why it needs to be existing as an entity anymore. Why does it need to exist if everybody's going to shop around for credits? What is the meaning of a university? Really, the document doesn't articulate for us. So it's much more evident in higher education, but I can well imagine that seeping into the space of school itself. Recently, I was listening to this Pratichi symposium, and there was one teacher who spoke so eloquently about her own role as a teacher. You know, it struck me. She said that as a teacher, I'm not just making children learn, I'm educating them. So she was really drawing attention to the work of teacher beyond ensuring that foundational learning is achieved. And a lot of the identity work, the formation of the value base, the formation of citizenship and personhood, which forms the work of a teacher, you know, that element is what she was articulating. And I thought that, you know, yes, I've been thinking about these questions, but here was this practicing professional articulating it so appropriately. And I think that those are questions that we should be thinking about. Now, I won't say that the NEP is responsible for all of this. Most certainly, as we read the NEP, we can decipher and we can hear these coming out of the NEP. We hear many things. We also hear these things. It's in that sense, you know, quite. I don't yet want to decide that you can read whatever you want into the NEP. I've not yet reached that stage. I feel we need much more rigorous content analysis to really decipher what is its underlying ethical structure and moral base, its moral compass. We need to establish through much more detailed content analysis, not by anecdotally picking up stuff here and there which suit our arguments. So at this point, I feel that it's saying many things, but I think this tendency of the you know, the deep instrumentalization of the teacher is something that has been creeping in education for the last 20 years. It's not something new that we are suddenly confronted with. It's been happening and it's been creeping through the system. And many of the structures that already exist exhibit this kind of extreme instrumentalization of the teacher.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think and I believe everyone had a great session. Ma'am, I'm moving forward to the closing of the session. And I thank our honored Dr. Padma Sarangapani for talking so extensively about the topic and giving her time to us. I also extend our thanks to the professors of TISS for providing us with this opportunity. I extend my gratitude to the technical staff as well as my fellow volunteers for making this session a success. Lastly, I thank the audience for bringing in their questions and being patient throughout the session that we had. For the people who are asking about the recording, it will be available in a week or two on the YouTube, so you can access through that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.